Well, it's just past 3 o'clock, so it's time to start this afternoon's proceedings. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first lecture in this year's Faraday Institute summer course. My name is Keith Fox. I'm director of the Faraday Institute. The summer course is one of the highlights of our year. We have a wealth of talks coming during the coming week, with science and faith topics each day, ranging from history and society, origins and evolution, the universe, neuroscience, caring for the environment. This afternoon's plenary lecture is free, but you'll need to register if you want to listen to the ones in the rest of the week. Places are still available. Details of how to do that you can find on the Faraday website at faraday.institute/interaction. I guess that most of us are familiar with the webinar format by now. Alister will speak to us for about 45 minutes, followed by some time for questions. Please type this in the Q&A box you'll find somewhere on your screen. And you can do that anytime during or after the talk, and I'll relay them to the speaker in question time. It is a special pleasure to welcome Professor Alister McGrath this afternoon as our speaker. Alister is the Andreas Idrius Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University. He studied chemistry as an undergraduate and completed a PhD in molecular biophysics in Oxford, but also has degrees in theology and is an ordained priest in the Church of England. Alister is a prolific writer and is known to many of us through his books. And this afternoon, he's going to speak to us on his own life in science and religion. Alister, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And it really is a pleasure to be able to speak to you, even though it has to be remotely. And in this lecture, what I want to do is to talk about my own journey of personal discovery through science, faith, and doubt. And all of this really begins in the late 1960s. And I know that's a very long time ago, but really that's when the story starts. And I was then a rebellious, free-thinking atheist, and I developed a love for the natural sciences. And I was convinced at that stage that science and faith were incompatible. So science was about facts and religious belief was about, well, running away from reality, making up your beliefs to suit your tastes. But curiously, and I'll tell you about this as we go along, I found my way to Christianity. And I'm now a lapsed atheist, although I've no hostility towards atheism. I respect the position, although, of course, I no longer hold it myself. So my love of science really began with a sense of wonder at the beauty of the natural world, especially the night sky. And as I looked at it, I often had the sense of standing on the threshold or the brink of some new world that beckoned to me, inviting me to discover more about its secrets and its mysteries. And a great uncle who worked in the pathology department at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast heard about my growing interest in nature and actually gave me his old German microscope from his time as a medical student. And here it is, made in 1904. And this actually was very important to me because this became my gateway to the natural world. It showed its wonders. It made me get excited about nature, and it still sits here in my office as a reminder of the power of nature to excite me. And I later built myself a small telescope to look at the night sky. So I became really enthralled by science. It was very exciting. And so I eventually set myself the goal of studying chemistry at Oxford University. I love chemistry. Oxford was the best place to study chemistry in the United Kingdom. And I found that really exciting, even though I was beginning to realize that the more I understood about how our world functioned, the less purpose it seemed to have for anything. I mean, the starlight heavens really seemed beautiful, but they were elegant symbols of cosmic meaninglessness and human insignificance. However, when I was 16, I became a committed atheist. I think there are probably a number of reasons for this. One of them was that I took the view that science was the only reliable form of knowledge, and that science really was the only way I could have certainty about things in life. At that time, I was very intolerant of uncertainty, and science really spoke to this deep need to be sure about things. But I also, and this is the second reason, shared the widespread belief that science and religion were at war with each other. This is the conflict narrative, and we'll talk about this during the conference this week a bit. Now, back in the 1960s, this was the received wisdom of the day. But as I think many of you will know, modern scholarship has thoroughly dismantled this idea that science and religion have always been fighting each other. The modern scholarly consensus is that while there are points of tension between science and religion, their relationship is complex. There's no right way of understanding their relationship. And Thomas Dixon, a very good British historian of science, would say that this really was invented in the 1700s. It was kind of way given a new lease of life by Victorian free thinkers in the late 1800s and is defended today by people like Richard Dawkins, who don't know very much about history. However, historians now give us much better models of understanding. But back then in the 1960s, it just seemed to me obvious science and religion are at war with each other. Because I loved science, I had to be at war with religion. But there was a third reason for embracing atheism as well. Because I was growing up in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and in the late 1960s, the phenomenon called the Troubles began to develop. This is sectarian conflicts. And my atheist friends at the time just said, look, the problem here is religion. Religion is the cause of religious violence. If there's no religion, there's no violence. And that spoke to me really quite powerfully at the time. Now, I know you'll be thinking as I've been speaking that these are not very good reasons, but you have to understand that at the time, these seemed very significant, very compelling to me as a 16-year-old. So at the age of 16, I felt I had sorted out all the really important issues in life and could focus on getting a place at Oxford University to study chemistry. And I have to tell you, I was successful in doing so. In December 1970, I discovered I'd won the scholarship to study chemistry from October 1971, which is great news. But I had to do something to fill the time between leaving school and going to university. And many of my friends kind of traveled the world or earned money. Maybe this says tell you something about me, but I decided to stay on at school and actually do a bit more studying. I wanted to learn German and Russian because these are both important scientific languages. And also I hadn't actually done enough study in biology. So I decided I would really go to Oxford completely equipped and so spent a lot of time doing these things. And so I began an intense program of reading in the school science library. I exhausted all the works in biology, and then I came to a new section that I hadn't noticed before called the history and the philosophy of science. Now, it was rather dusty, so I suspect that it wasn't used very often, but I thought I ought to read this. Surely I also know something about this. And as I read, I found a new, unsettling, uncertain world opening up. I began to realize that my view of science at that time was actually very naive. I had simply failed to appreciate the importance of things like the underdetermination of theory by data or radical theory change in the history of science, or indeed the problems in trying to figure out what is the best explanation of a given set of observations. And I began to realize that what science believes now is not necessarily what science will believe in 10, 15, or 20 years' time. In other words, science is provisional. And as I read Arthur Koestler, I recall one sentence that I found in one of his books. I'll read it to you now, and you can see why it was so unsettling. Koestler wrote, "The progress of science is strewn like an ancient desert trail with the bleached skeletons of discarded theories, which once seemed to possess eternal life." So you can see my dilemma. Things were a lot more complicated than I had realized. And I began to come to the reluctant conclusion that science was much more complex than I had realized, that it didn't really give me a total certainty I needed. And I was going to have to face up to this. Now, actually, let me tell you something. When I read Richard Dawkins, I get all nostalgic because he has this hopelessly optimistic view of science, which I had when I was 16 years old. So it's a nice reminder of my past, but I'm no longer there. Now, here's the point I want to make. The lines of thought I've just described did not directly call into question my atheism or indeed move me towards religious belief. What they did do was to cause me to pause for thought because things were not as simple as I'd thought. And it did make me ask some very awkward questions, like, for example, why had I embraced atheism? What exactly was its evidential basis? Well, that was a difficult one. I mean, atheism was very trendy at that time. It seemed to be the way things were going. But the real problem is that this sounded very much like Sigmund Freud's idea of wish fulfillment, in which we invent a worldview that fits in with our tastes, because I didn't want anybody to tell me what to do. I wanted to be free. I wanted to invent things as I saw fit, not to have to kind of buy into something that was already there. And as I began to think about this, I began to wonder if I'd invented atheism so I could be free of any interference or influence from some transcendent reality. And as some of you will know, many atheists today do this. For example, if you read philosopher Thomas Nagel, who incidentally I engage a lot in my recent writings, he's very interesting. But Thomas Nagel is very, very clear. He was an atheist. And the reason he's an atheist is he didn't want there to be a God. He began by not wanting there to be a God, and then kind of worked out the ideas why God couldn't be there to follow us. Listen to this. This is what Nagel says. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. What I want you to notice here is that Nagel is saying, here's what I would like to be the case. Now I'm going to find some reasons for saying that this actually is the case. So anyway, I found myself going up to Oxford to study chemistry in October 1971 with lots of unanswered questions. My hope was that when I went to Oxford, I'd meet lots of atheists who would sort me out and reconfirm my commitment to atheism. It didn't work out like that, I have to say to you. And let me tell you what happened. At Oxford, I discovered Christianity. And there were a number of influences here, and I'll tell you about them in a moment. But first of all, I need to tell you about my discovery of Albert Einstein. It happened in my first year at Oxford when I was specializing in the study of quantum theory. At Oxford, you're allowed to study in depth in one particular area, and I decided quantum theory would be my area of choice. So I got to know Einstein very, very well. And the basic insight I read in Einstein was that science is wonderful, but needs to be supplemented and enriched if we're going to engage with the really important questions in life. And Einstein was very clear. Science, ethics, politics, and religion, they're all different, but they all have a role to play in helping us to live meaningful life. And the fact that science and religion are different does not mean that they are incompatible. I mean, for example, science and ethics are completely different fields of thought, but that doesn't mean that scientists can't be ethical people. And again, this was a very unsettling thought, because I had originally the idea that because science and religion were different, they couldn't be compatible, and therefore, if you were a scientist, you couldn't be religious. I began to realize things weren't quite as simple as I had thought. And Einstein really helped me to see I needed a grander vision of reality than that which science could offer me on its own. But, I wasn't just reading Einstein during my first term in Oxford. I was also talking to scientists about, big issues in life, like what's life all about? I discovered very quickly that a lot of the scientific students I knew at Oxford, and indeed those who were teaching me science, were actually religious believers who found that their science was enriched by their faith. And again, this didn't fit in with what I'd been taught, that science and religion were at war with each other. And as I began to talk to people at Oxford, I began to realize I had misunderstood what Christianity was all about. I had overestimated the ability of atheism to make sense of our world. And so, if I can put it very, very simply, and cut a long story short, I set aside my atheism and embraced Christianity. It was, I have to say, rather cerebral and intellectual conversion, which really focused on the idea that actually believing in God made a lot more sense of things than atheism did. So I became a Christian with lots of unresolved questions. And if you like, I had ended up on a new island, and I didn't know it. And I was trying to explore it and find what this strange new world was like. And I began to read C.S. Lewis in 1974, and actually he became something of an intellectual lodestar, a traveling companion through life. And in 1974, I read this sentence. It's from his lecture, Is Theology Poetry?, for the very first time. Those of you who read my writings will know I repeat this endlessly and bore my readers silly, but here is the sentence that really captivated my imagination. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Now, the reason that was so exciting for me is it suddenly said to me, look, science and faith can be held together. Lewis was clear that the Christian faith offered you this imaginatively rich, this intellectually capacious vision of reality, which made sense of life and fitted in the natural sciences. And that was very exciting for me. It was almost as if a kind of intellectual sun had risen and illuminated the scientific landscape, and I could see details and interconnections that otherwise I would simply not have noticed before. So what Lewis really did was to help me think in terms of a big picture. Christianity gives you this larger vision of reality, which helps you to live a good life, to make sense of our world, but also to make links between science and faith. And Lewis, I think, helped me to see that my Christian faith was like a lens that seemed able to bring things into focus, to articulate the idea that Christianity gave me a vision of reality which made sense not simply of life, but of my love for science. And I began to realize I could hold together my science and my faith. So Lewis was very, very important, but somebody else helped me as well. Because I was an undergraduate at Wadham College in Oxford, and after discovering Christianity, I began to go to the college chapel on Sunday evenings and heard some rather good sermons and some rather poor sermons. But one of the ones I heard was preached by Charles Coulson. Charles Coulson was Oxford University's first professor of theoretical chemistry. He was a fellow of Wadham College and a prominent Methodist lay preacher. He gave a sermon in the college chapel on science and faith. And I don't recall the sermon being very long. I think it was about 10 minutes long, but it changed my thinking. I think I'd gone into that sermon thinking, look, there's my science, there's my faith. I can hold them together. Not quite sure how, but I know I can do it. It's just at the moment, I have to think about this. I don't know how it can be done. But Coulson showed me. It was as if a light had been turned on in the recesses of my mind that Sunday evening, allowing me to see the relation of science and faith in a new way. And as many of you will know, Coulson's basic argument was that science and faith offer us different insights on understanding our world. They allow us different perspectives on a complex reality, which couldn't be limited or restricted to the insights from either science or faith, but put them together. And if you like, you get a stereoscopic vision of reality. Now, that was very, very exciting. And those of you who've read my books will know that actually I still inhabit that same framework to this day. Sure, I've developed it in various ways, but Coulson gave me that way of thinking. I've developed it. I want to make a very important point here, if I may, and that is that Coulson actually was a mentor to me. He died quite shortly afterwards, unfortunately, from cancer, but he and I got to know each other, talked to each other. He helped me sort out how to see the relation of science and faith. And in one sense, hearing me speak to you today is hearing the echo of his voice and is a testimony to his impact on many people, including myself. Now, let me tell you what happened next. I mentioned I began to read C.S. Lewis. I really enjoyed him and began to realize that Lewis's rich understanding of the Christian faith actually rested on a deep understanding of theology. In other words, Lewis became my gateway to a rich world of theologians who I felt I ought to read. And I began to realize that I wanted to study theology seriously. And basically, the question was, how on earth was I going to do this? And the answer is I was able to do it by accident because I did a doctorate in Oxford on molecular biophysics and did rather well. So I was awarded a scholarship at one of the colleges, Merton College, and discovered that the scholarship I'd been awarded might allow me to continue my doctoral research and study theology at the same time. So in a period of 3 years, I got my doctorate in molecular biophysics and then first-class honors in theology. And I began to specialize in intellectual history and theology at Cambridge. And then in 1983, I came back to Oxford to teach theology at Wycliffe Hall, which is a theological college of the Church of England. And that began my long link with Oxford as a theologian, which of course continues to this day. So I want to emphasize that I arrived at Oxford as a theologian, very interested in the question of the relation of science and faith, but feeling I can't really talk about this properly until I've really developed my theological skills. So I continued to really focus on theology for about 12 more years until I really felt I had gained my skills. And so I wrote books like this one, there's Justitia Dei, A History of the Christian Doctrine of Justification. It's one of the most boring books you'll ever have read, but it's very rigorous academically. And the point is, this really is about me beginning to establish my reputation as a theologian. Then in 1999, Oxford made me their professor of historical theology. And I felt when that happened, now I can finally say I'm not just someone who's good at science, I'm also good at theology. So I thought, right, time to start thinking about the relationship of science and faith. So really, I've always been interested in this relationship, but I hadn't really done very much writing or talking on this topic because I felt I didn't know enough about Christian theology to kind of make connections properly. And so I began to really do this in detail. In 2001 to 3, I wrote 3 volumes of a work called Scientific Theology. It was basically my attempt to begin to think through questions in the field. Very technical book or series of books, not very interesting, but something much more interesting happened around this time. In 2002, I was asked if I would take part in a 3-way private debate at Balliol College, Oxford, on the rationality of religious belief in the light of the natural sciences. And I had 2 atheist opponents in that debate, Peter Atkins, an Oxford physical chemist, who, by the way, taught me quantum theory, and Richard Dawkins, who doesn't need introduction. At that time, he was simply an Oxford evolutionary biologist. Now, here's the point I'm going to make. It was an interesting debate, although I have to say it was a bit inconclusive. But the debate convinced me there was an urgent need to really focus on the field of science and religion, not just at the academic level, but also at the popular level, because I was convinced that an increasingly important public debate about the rationality of religious belief was about to happen, and the natural sciences were going to be the chosen weapon of my atheist opponents. And I was quite clear Dawkins was going to be a major voice in this debate. So I researched his writings very carefully and thoroughly, and in 2004 published a book called Dawkins' God, which was the first critical scholarly account of Dawkins' understanding of the relation of science and faith. And I was right, because as you probably know, 2 years later in 2006, the new atheism made its noisy appearance, creating massive media interest in questions of religious faith. And basically, it was very, very important to begin to engage these questions. There was rising public disquiet about the implications of religious extremism following 9/11. And people, I think, wanted a new way of thinking. And Dawkins and Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris seemed to offer a very simple, unproblematic approach. You believe what science tells you, and that's it. And if science can prove its beliefs, then so should religion. And if religion can't prove its beliefs, well, don't take them seriously. And that, I think, was a very important moment. Because having published that book on Dawkins and kind of way being happy to take part in public debates, I found myself being summoned to take part in these massive discussions all over the place. For example, in March 2006, I debated with Daniel Dennett over his book, Breaking the Spell, at the Royal Society of Arts in London. I gave a talk entitled The Spell of the Meme, which argued that Dennett raised some very interesting questions, but he didn't actually realize they affected his own position. And he seemed to think his own ideas were exempt from the factors he'd mentioned. And I was able to bring out some rather awkward questions. But here's the point I want to make. This debate with Daniel Dennett really brought home to me something, which is that in the debate between science and faith, there's a kind of what I might call epistemic asymmetry. Again, epistemic asymmetry. What I mean by that is that Dennett and Dawkins used standards of evidence to judge religious writers, and they didn't apply those standards to their own writings. In other words, they seemed to think their own beliefs didn't need to be subjected to the same standard as the views of other people they disagreed with. And then, of course, a few months later, Dawkins published his God Delusion, which became one of the most influential books of 2006. Now, I debated Dawkins' views with him on BBC television that summer, and I realized it was necessary to respond. So basically, knowing his views on these matters better than anyone else, I set out with my wife to write a book focusing on the arguments he set out in the God Delusion. And I published it with a Christian publisher here in Britain, SPCK, and we were able to fast track the book. We kept it short, and it appeared in February 2007, 4 months after I began to write the book. And it became an international bestseller. Now, sure, other more detailed, more considered, better responses would follow from other people later, but this book really was an intervention to kind of say it's not as simple as what Dawkins is saying, and it just offered what people needed so badly at that time, a short, clear, convincing response to Dawkins' main lines of arguments. So that became very, very important. But I must emphasize, I didn't stop being an academic. I mean, I was very busy giving lectures like the 2008 Riddle Memorial Lectures at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, or the Gifford Lectures at the University of Aberdeen, or the Halcyon Lectures at the University of Cambridge. My favorite of those 3 lectures was the Riddle Lectures because C.S. Lewis had given the Riddle Lectures back in the 1940s. His book, The Abolition of Man, is those lectures he gave during the Second World War. So I felt very nice to have that historical continuity with C.S. Lewis. So basically, I now began to feel that I needed to move from, in effect, a purely academic environment to an environment where I'd be able to engage with clergy who were trying to face up to these questions in their preaching and their ministry. So in 2008, I left Oxford to take up a professorship of theology, ministry and education at King's College, London. And I felt, really the time had come to leave Oxford because I knew it so well. I'd been there for most of my life, and I needed a different environment. And it was wonderful to be able to engage in some big events in the metropolis, at St. Paul's Cathedral at Westminster Abbey. And it also gave me a chance to teach a course in science and religion. That was very important. Mike Poole and I, between us, we put together a rather good course, and that ran very, very successfully. So I enjoyed that time very, very much. But it wasn't to be the end, because in April 2014, I came back to Oxford to take up the Andreas Idris Professorship of Science and Religion. And this, I think, was very important because it provided me with a platform for developing my ideas about the relationship of science and theology, while also engaging a broader theme, which is the need for theology to engage with other disciplines. So in many ways, this is the high point of my career. I never, however, lost my interest in public engagement. And in fact, I will tell you about this. In 2015, I took up additionally what's called the Gresham Professorship of Divinity. Gresham College, London, those who are historians will know, was intimately involved in the formation of the Royal Society, the development of natural sciences of Britain. Gresham College, London was founded in 1597 with a chair in theology, and that's the chair I held. And it allowed me to continue my work of public engagement in London. I gained some very large audiences for those lectures. So that, if you like, is an overview of my life in science and religion. Obviously, it's not over yet. I mean, I've actually had a sabbatical year from Oxford, during which I've written 3 books and lots of research articles. And it's been very, very exciting. There's been a kind of intellectual rejuvenation for me. But I do want to say something which I think is very, very important, which may be helpful in just reflecting on my own career and asking how this might be of some interest to other people as well. I think one point I want to make is that we really do need more people to be active in this field. As you'll have gathered from my story, I mean, everything seemed to happen by accident, or if you want to be more theological, by divine providence. I mean, I had, when I was 18, a serious personal issue to sort out. I loved science. I'd become a Christian. So how on earth did I hold these together? And did I kind of way bifurcate my mind? Or did I find some way of holding science and faith together? So there was a personal issue here. It mattered to me personally to resolve this question. And that gave me a kind of motivation to want to sort this out. But I'm sure there are many people listening to me today who will be saying, well, actually, I could help. And if that's you, will you please do something about it? Because I think we do need lots of people to be able to speak, to be able to write, to be able to offer us wisdom on these things. And that, I think, is really something that's very important indeed. But here's a second point, which I think is very, very important. I think as I've been talking to you, I've mentioned the rise of the new atheism, people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and of course, Christopher Hitchens. And what I found to be very, very interesting about this is initially this was received uncritically by the media. I mean, the new atheism was very, very good on sound bites and not so good in arguments, but the sound bites really connected with people and made them feel it had a kind of intellectual respectability and depth. And I think that for about 10 years, that illusion persisted. It now has gone. And atheism, I think, has now moved away from the kind of approach that Richard Dawkins adopted. I think most atheist friends I have now are quite clear of the limits of the science and want to have more serious conversations about the relation of science and faith. And I think it's very important because, again, who's going to take part in those conversations? Well, might I suggest that some of you listening to me here might actually be able to do something very important about this. Now, if you were to ask me to kind of summarize my view of the relation of science and faith, I think the one word I would use would be enrichment. Here's a point I'm going to make. The thing I've discovered is that it's not so much thinking about the compatibility of science and faith. Compatibility means, well, there's one here, there's one there. They don't fight each other. They're not inconsistent with each other, but they don't do anything together. I'm not saying that. I'm saying they are both distinct. Their integrity needs to be respected, but they can talk to each other and say some important things. So, for example, one area which I've been really interested in is the area of what's called natural theology, which is a debated term. I mean, it's really best understood as a kind of connection of some sort between the world of nature and a transcendent realm or God, leaving open the question of whether you're moving from nature to God or God to nature, but saying there's some kind of relationship between them. I found that to be very exciting and have written quite extensively on that broad topic. But one of the points I want to make here is that actually approaching science from a Christian perspective does allow you to say that, science is great in helping us to understand how things function, but it's not so good when it comes to understanding what they mean. And for me, one of the things that Christianity is able to do is to enable a scientist to engage with questions of morality, what's this, what's the good life, how do we live it, and meaning. What's the point of things? Because science actually can't really answer those questions of meaning or value on its own. I know Richard Dawkins thinks it can, but when you look at what he says, not actually really very persuasive. But I also want to make the point that actually science can help us enrich our faith. Let me give you an example. One of my favorite biblical texts, well, actually, I have lots of favorite biblical texts. This is one of them. It is Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. And if you're a scientist, you'll know just how vast our universe is. So if you like, the psalmist's words are given added depth and significance by our scientific understanding of things, which actually, if you like, imaginatively enriches our understanding of the glory and majesty of God. If universe is this vast, this immense, that helps us to gain a sense of the glory of God. So looking back over my career, I think there are a few points I'm going to make in just bringing this lecture to a close. And obviously, I'm very happy to explore questions in more detail in response to the questions that you would like to ask. Here's one point that I think is really important. When I was 16, I was absolutely convinced that science entailed atheism. And I think that there are lots of 16-year-olds today who think that. And one of the things I want to say is that's not a stable position. And you may find simply that people, as they grow older, become much more willing to tolerate uncertainty and to realize the complexity of things. Looking back on my own life, I realized that when I was 16, I was looking for a very simple, very certain way of looking at things which didn't actually correspond to the way the world really was. So what I want to say is that actually those of you who are doing work with teenagers in schools, things like that, is really important, but do help them to see it's a bit more complicated than people like Richard Dawkins are saying. And if you want to know more about my own journey of faith, then this book called Through a Glass Darkly, which came out last year, tells the story of my own early atheism and my move away from it. So that's one thing I'd like to say. Here is another thing. One of the things I've really discovered in becoming more involved in the field of science and religion is how many good people there are in the field, how many excellent organizations. In Oxford, we have the Ian Ramsay Centre. In Cambridge, you have the Faraday Institute. They're doing very, very good work. And I think it's very important to, in effect, find some ways of helping these people, of supporting these institutions, but also working out if there are still further things that need to be done. And again, it's that question of, what is there that I can do? What is there that needs to be done? Where do I fit into a bigger scheme of things with my own particular background, whether it's in science or faith or indeed both? So let me, if I may, now begin to bring this lecture to an end and then move into a time of question and answer. In preparing this lecture for you this afternoon, I've really enjoyed just reflecting on my own past. But one of the things I think I need to say as I close is this, that actually, I know this sounds strange, but having been an atheist and then become a Christian has helped me to appreciate the intellectual vision of Christianity far more than I think if I had grown up as a Christian. Because you see, I've been in a far country. Think of the parable of the prodigal son. I know what it's like in atheism, and I know why, in my view, it's not intellectually habitable and it's not spiritually interesting. And that's one of the reasons why I think the whole area of apologetics is so important, being able to try and explain why faith makes sense and why faith is able to answer some of the questions that science cannot really answer using its own resources, what Karl Popper called ultimate questions. So if you like the prodigal son and you've been to that far country, atheism, and then come back, I think it really gives you a deeper sense of the intellectual excitement of Christianity. And maybe that's a very good point at which to end this lecture, on a high note, simply saying that one of my greatest discoveries is that which C.S. Lewis knew long before me. And it's that ability of Christianity to make sense of life, to make sense of our world, but also to give us a good framework for discussion of science and religion. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Alister, for that very illuminating talk that took us on your own journey and challenged us to where we might be going today. There's a number of questions coming in the chat. I'll try and summarize some of them and bring things together. One question that's come up a few times is that you've mentioned in your early part of the talk some of the new atheists desire not to believe. Is there in some people the opposite of that, if you like, the fundamentalist view of the impossibility of considering that there couldn't be a God?
I think that my impression is that there are some people who, in effect, do not want to go there, and therefore, in effect, almost lay down in advance that there cannot be a God. I don't want there to be a God, and then provide reasons for this. And one of the things that I've noticed is in debating, particularly Richard Dawkins, but we see the same thing with Christopher Hitchens, is that, if you like, there's an absolute fixity. In effect, the question is shut down. It's absolutely certain there is no God. And one of the things that I suggested in that book I wrote in response to Richard Dawkins, the Dawkins delusion, is that actually Dawkins does represent a form of atheist fundamentalism. And some atheists objected to this, and I had an argument with them. But the point I was trying to make is this. If you're a fundamentalist, then in effect, the world is bifurcated. There's light and there's darkness. You're in the light, everyone else is darkness. And you see that in Dawkins, I'm afraid, that in effect, unwillingness to engage seriously with the other side. But the other point, which I think is very, very interesting, is that there's this reluctance on Dawkins' part to even ask the question, why do intelligent people believe in God? And the answer is because they're deluded, they're mad. But that is not really a very satisfying answer. It may satisfy some new atheist foot soldiers, but everyone else can say, no, it's not that simple. They've seen something you have missed. Don't you think you ought to be checking this out yourself? So I think that's quite an important point to make. Cicero once said that nothing convinces like conviction. And the point he's making is that if you say something with total confidence, people are likely to believe you. And actually, now people would say that Dawkins and Hitchens relied on this totally confident assertion of their atheism. But the evidence, the arguments were way behind. And I think people have now begun to realize that.
Thank you. You touched towards the end of your talk on questions of natural theology. And if you might want to unpack that a little bit further as to whether science actually provides proofs of the existence of God and the truth of, say, the Christian faith.
I don't think that science provides what we might call proofs in that strong sense of the word. I mean, for me, the word proof would mean something which I've seen. It is so compelling, I can't really say no. What I see in science is suggestive. It's suggestive. It's deeply suggestive. It raises some very interesting questions. It can't answer those questions by itself. So I think that that's a very important point. And I think one of the questions we have to ask is, do we in effect look at the world and say, scientific observation proves there is a God, or do we come at it from the other way? If there is a God, how much does the idea of God make sense of what we're seeing in science? And in many ways, that's kind of the approach I tend to adopt, which is to say, how great is the resonance between a Christian belief in God and what we would expect when we look at the natural world? And that's one of the themes that John Polkinghorne, of course, developed extensively in his books. And his argument is that it's a kind of new type of natural theology, which is not about saying nature proves there's a God, but rather that the Christian way of looking at things resonates or is congruent with the way the world is. And that is in itself a very good reason for thinking Christianity is right, even though you might not believe in God for that reason. You believe in it for some other reason, but then you bring this lens to bear on looking at nature, and it makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. So what do you think are the most important unresolved theological questions that are raised in the natural sciences?
What do I think are the most unresolved? I think the most unresolved question from within the natural science is why there is something rather than nothing. I think that remains on the table. It's a theological question, it's a scientific question, it's a philosophical question. And really, as Stephen Weinberg said in a recent article, that all scientists can really do is say, well, look, it's there. I mean, we can't go behind it. It's a singular event. All we can say is that there is this universe with these properties. We can understand these properties. If you then say why those properties and not some other properties, or why is there a universe at all, you really all you can say is it's there. Get used to it. Let's try and investigate. So if you like, I think there is a real, if you like, barrier which you cannot go through scientifically, in the sense that because it's a singular event, you just cannot do the kind of experiment, ask the kind of questions that you might do. So I think is a very important point. And I think that there are others you could mention. John Polkinghorne talks about meta questions, which he means questions that science raises, but actually can't answer on its own. And this would be a very good example, I think, of a meta question.
Your own journey is one from atheism to Christian faith. Do you think that any religion has the ability to establish a peaceful relationship with science?
I think my view, which may be right, but my view is that we need to encourage people to find ways of relating faith and science, realizing that there are going to be a lot of loose ends, that actually, there's always going to be that happening. In my own case, in Christianity, I can see some very good ways of doing this. And it's so important that we have Christians who are scientists who can bear witness to the ability to bring these together and hold these together, which I think is very important. I do know from private conversations that some of my friends who belong to other religions do find this slightly less easy. My Muslim friends, for example, do find a degree of tension. So I think I prefer not to comment on other faiths because I don't feel I know enough about them. What I would say, though, is that actually, I was talking earlier in this talk about the warfare narrative between science and religion. It's very, very Western. And Elaine Eklund and others have made the point that if you go to India or if you go to Japan or if you go to China, you just don't find that. You find a kind of base assumption that actually these can work together. So it's very important, I think, to make the point that the warfare novel is very strongly culturally conditioned.
Thank you. Thank you. So one question here is that one of the toughest things for scientists to swallow about religion and Christian religion in particular is miracles involving the natural world, breaches of that natural causation. Are there any miracle stories that are central to your own belief? And how do you respond to the scientist who says, well, that's a breach of the natural law, it can't happen?
I think this is a very good question. I think I ought to engage it properly because I think a lot of people will be very interested by this question. Isaac Newton once made the point that if a miracle happens a lot of times, you stop thinking it as being miraculous. And actually, I'm sitting in my study, I'm looking at a beautiful landscape, and every time I look, I think, isn't it wonderful? It's amazing. But because I've seen it so often, I lose that sense of wonder, the sense it's very, very special. And Newton was simply making the point, when something happens a lot or happens regularly, we just cease to appreciate it. It's quite miraculous it's there at all. When you plant a seed in the ground, it grows. I mean, it's astonishing. So I think that's a very important point to begin with. But there's a more serious question, and it's this. Peter Harrison, who I think is speaking to the conference tomorrow, is a very able historian of the relation of science and faith. And he makes the point that the phrase, the laws of nature, really began to be used only in the late 17th century. In other words, 1680s, 1690s. And people really didn't think of miracles as breaking laws of nature at all. They thought of them as much more things that exceeded nature's natural capacity to happen. And the point we do need to make is that David Hume, in a very famous book of, I think it was 1734, talked about miracles as breaking or violating the laws of nature. But you see, the laws of nature was a recent invention. People just didn't think of it like that. If you take, for example, Robert Boyle, a very able natural philosopher, Boyle's law and all that. I mean, his view was, sure, God acts regularly, but when he needs something special, he'll do it. And that's just the way things are. So in effect, what you're talking about is the sort of idea you find in Spinoza, which is the philosophical absolutization of laws of nature. These aren't just descriptions of the regularities of nature. You're saying it has to be like this all the time. And that moves, I think, into a different ballpark. So if we look at someone like Keith Ward, for example, Keith Ward will say, well, look, what you are doing is you're just using a particular definition of the laws of nature to limit God's action. And what happens if God's goal in creating the world is to make certain things happen, which are entirely in line with his will. Should it be miraculous that God does things to make those happen? I mean, I think it's very important just to see that the question is actually more complex than sometimes we realize.
Thank you very much. You've talked a lot about you're obviously as a professional scientist and then through as a professional and well-studied theologian. What about, if you like, the ordinary person who doesn't have skills in those sorts of areas, and how can they engage with that? Do we need to have a theology degree in order to be able to engage with the science-faith debate at the general level?
The short answer is no, but I think you'd like a longer answer than that.
Yes, please.
Here's what I want to say. Everybody has their own gifts and experience in this very important conversation. I have certain gifts, that's nice. But lots of other people have different gifts, and that's even more important. I think here is something that is really, really important. This is a piece of research done by Elaine Eklund, who, as many of you will know, is a sociologist at Rice University in the States, very interested in the relation of science and religion. And she did a sort of survey looking at the question of what is it that might make somebody think that Richard Dawkins was wrong in saying that science and religion were incompatible. And back came the answer. The answer is not so much an argument or a historical journal article. It is an individual who's a practicing scientist who's found a way of doing this and can talk about it. Because what people say is, oh, I know so-and-so. They find a way of doing it, so it can be done. Maybe Dawkins has a problem, but that guy doesn't. I think I could do that. You know, it's that. So what I want to say is that you do not need to be particularly saturated in Christian theology. You just need to have thought this sort of thing through, and in effect say, here's how I can do it. And because I can do it this way, maybe other people can do this as well. So I think that's a very important point. If you like, there are multiple approaches here. It's very important each approach is represented. I represent one approach, but there are lots of others. And my advice to all those listening is find your own level, find your own approach, and be assured you can be useful.
Thank you. There's a question here that says that we might agree that science is limited, but there are lots of ways in which we just don't know what we don't know, to take a Donald Rumsfeldism. So how do you respond to the avowed agnostic who says we can never know, so let's sit on the fence?
I think that there are some people who would fit in that category. I think of Stephen Jay Gould, who really self-defined not as an atheist, but an agnostic, meaning by that, look, the evidence isn't good enough for me to actually come down on any particular side of this debate. And he kind of kept it open. But he's not like Richard Dawkins. He's very, very clear. There are good reasons for believing in God, for being religious. Just he doesn't actually think these are decisively right. So I guess the question you're really inviting me to explore is, will there be some people who say, look, I'm sorry, I just can't make a decision? And I respect that position. And actually, it's a very interesting question, which I remember engaging with when I was transitioning from atheism to Christianity, because I'd read Bertrand Russell's book, which is a History of Western Philosophy. Indeed, many of you listening to me will know that book. And Russell self-defined as an atheist, but he made it very, very clear he didn't know atheism was right. He couldn't prove it. There's a very famous line in History of Western Philosophy where he says that philosophy, in effect, helps us to live without uncertainty. Philosophy helps us to live with uncertainty without being paralyzed by hesitation. And certainly making the point that all the big questions in life, including the God question, lie beyond proof. So whatever you think, it's a matter of faith. So that brought home to me that as an atheist, I was taking that position as a matter of faith because I couldn't realize it, couldn't actually prove it. And that was very important to me. But then, of course, having shown you can't prove atheism is right, Russell took a pragmatist approach. The evidence doesn't prove there's no God, but I'm going to live my life on the basis that there is none. In other words, it's a pragmatic decision. And, I think that that's a conversation we can have with people. You may feel the evidence doesn't compel you to one position or another, but in effect, there's some points at which you're going to have to, in practice, function as if one decision or the other decision is right. I think that's a very helpful way of just beginning to open these questions up.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There's a question that says, can you suggest maybe a couple of practical ways in which the church can present, and it's again at a grassroots level, but I think it's the practical is the emphasis on that, a relevant message on the interaction between faith and science?
Yes, again, I think that's a very important question. And there, as you will know, there are many individuals and organizations trying to help churches to engage with these questions, particularly in big university cities. Obviously, situations vary from one church to another, but here are some points I think ought to be made. Number one is that a lot of clergy don't really feel comfortable in talking about this area because it's not something they really feel particularly knowledgeable about. And again, that's why it's so important. The clergy might not be able to answer these questions by themselves, but they could interview a scientist in their congregation and in effect put some of the questions you've put to me to those scientists, and that would help the congregation think these questions through. I think that is very useful. Another thing that could be done is to have discussion groups on science and faith, perhaps reading something very accessible like something by John Polkinghorne. And in effect, because he's so clear, it can be a very good way of opening these questions up. That's another thing I think would be helpful. But what I would say is that really something does need to be done. And very often clergy feel they don't know enough to deal with these questions. What I want to say is we need to find ways for clergy to feel able to ask their scientific congregational members to help them out, either by talking about this or being interviewed or by leading a discussion group. I think that would be a very helpful way ahead here.
And some of those things originate when with children, with those who are very young. How can we instill in them that wonder of science and the truth of belief? How would you tackle with those sorts of issues?
I think that's a very interesting question because there's a lot of work done on what is called childhood spirituality. And what I mean by that is that children, when they're quite young, have this natural sense, well, the world makes sense and there's a kind of God, and it's almost as if that's their intuitive starting position. And I think that in fact they move away from that during their teens. I think we need to find ways of kind of way building on this. And it's quite difficult to know what to do because many of the organizations that are engaging these questions are doing it at the level of teenagers or university students or indeed professionals. But I think that there's more thought that needs to be done here. And certainly I think there are organizations, I think of Messy Church, for example, or Godly Play, where they're very concerned to try and speak to younger children and find a way of helping them to make connections between what's sometimes an intuitive faith and the way the world is disclosed through science.
So there is a question that actually maybe takes it to the fundamental level at which most people practice their belief. Is this, or how relevant is this to the average person? Is it more important their relationship with God and praying, or the academic research that tries to address those sorts of questions?
Thank you. Well, I think the answer is that it's very important that ordinary Christians know that there are people and resources and books which show it's perfectly possible to be a Christian and a scientist. They don't need to have assimilated that by themselves. They just need to know it can be done, to be able to point to people, point to books which in effect say this can be done. So I want to make the point that actually you can take this on trust. I would personally say do some reading and talking anyway, because that's very good. But the main point I want to make is simply this. During the period of the New Atheism, it's now behind us, a lot of Christians were very demoralized because they didn't know the answers, and Christian leaders weren't helping them to find the answers. I think we're now way past that. Things are much, much better than they were 10, 15 years ago. But I think it's still very important to say we have to find resources to help people know that this makes sense and it can be done.
And so is wonder one of the approaches through that, the sense of awe? You said about the heavens declare the glory of God.
Exactly. I think wonder is a gateway to both science and to faith, as you begin to realize that that wonder helps you discover science, but also you discover the glory of God in creation. So it's a wonderful gateway experience, if you like, to help us make sense of things.
Thank you. I think our time is up. Our hour is gone. You've given us a fantastic talk, Alister, and taken us through your own journey and challenged us as well. And I think we've worked you at the questions as well, and you've shown how well thought out your ideas are in this. And we look forward to hearing more from you. You're speaking to those who registered for the course tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, and we shall look forward to that. If we were in person, it would be time for a resounding round of applause. Please take that as read and as a virtual sound of clapping. So thank you ever so much for being with us. Remind everybody, to those who aren't registered, there's still the opportunity to do so at faraday.institute/interaction. And we look forward to seeing Alister again at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.